Poor Evelyn. I heard someone whisper before I even reached the chapel doors, and that was the moment I understood my husband's funeral was not going to be about grief at all. It was going to be about judgment. The morning air carried that late October chill that settles into your bones and makes every black coat feel thinner than it should. I stood for a moment on the stone walkway outside the funeral home, one gloved hand resting on the strap of my handbag, looking at the brass handle on the front door like it belonged to a building I had never entered before. Richard had been gone for 5 days. 5 days since the house had gone quiet in a way I had never known it could. 5 days since people started lowering their voices around me, speaking in that careful tone reserved for the sick, the fragile, and the newly useless. I had buried my parents. I had buried an older sister. I knew what mourning looked like. But this felt different. This felt staged. Someone had arranged the flowers in tall white sprays Richard would have hated. Someone had chosen a pale gray ribbon instead of navy, even though navy had been his color for 40 years. Someone had placed a framed photograph near the entrance, not the one of Richard laughing on the boat in Maine, not the one with his sleeves rolled up in our backyard, but a stiff studio portrait from a charity gala where he looked rich and distant and vaguely bored. I did not have to ask who had made those choices. Vanessa had always loved appearances more than memories. I stepped inside and the first thing I noticed was not the organ music or the scent of lilies. It was the seating chart. There, on a polished easel near the guest book, my name was printed in elegant black script at a side row near the back. Evelyn Carter, family. Family. Not wife. Not beloved wife of Richard Carter. Just family. As though after 42 years of marriage I had been gently reduced to one category among several. I kept my face still. That was the first lesson life teaches a woman my age if she is smart enough to learn it. The moment people start underestimating you, your silence becomes more valuable than your outrage. Across the room, Vanessa stood. Near the casket in a fitted black dress that looked more expensive than appropriate, one hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as if she were the one holding the family together. My son saw me and gave a small nod, the kind a man gives a neighbor in a grocery store aisle. No rush toward me. No hand at my back. No, Mom, are you okay? Just that little nod, polite and dry, and then his eyes shifted back to his wife. I felt something tighten in my chest, but it was not grief. Grief is softer. Grief bends. This was sharper than that. This had an edge. Evelyn, Vanessa said when I reached them. Her voice dipped in sympathy, so smooth it almost sounded rehearsed. She leaned in and air-kissed my cheek, careful not to smudge her makeup. You made it. I was just telling Daniel we should help you through today. I know this must all be overwhelming. Help me through today. I looked at her for one quiet second too long. I wondered if she heard herself. I wondered if Daniel did. If he did, he gave no sign. Thank you, I said. That was all. Nothing more. Her smile flickered, just once, like a lamp with a faulty bulb. She had expected fragility. Tears, maybe. Confusion. Some visible proof that I was already becoming the helpless widow they had imagined in the privacy of their kitchen. But I had spent 42 years married to a man who built things carefully and trusted very few people. Richard did not marry helpless women. He certainly did not leave one behind. Guests began to arrive in clusters, all dark suits and lowered voices, and I watched the room change around me. Men who had once stood when I entered a room now touched my elbow with pity. Women I had hosted for Christmas dinners tilted their heads and told me to take care of myself, as if I had suddenly become a houseplant with uncertain odds of survival. Every glance seemed to carry the same unspoken calculation. How much had Richard left? Had he left enough? Would I have to sell the house? Move somewhere smaller? Depend on Daniel and Vanessa? That was the cruelty of it. Nobody said the ugliest part out loud. They didn't have to. It floated through the room anyway, light as perfume. I signed. Nothing. I asked no questions. I simply observed. The funeral director greeted Vanessa first. The florist asked her where she wanted the extra arrangements moved. An old business associate of Richard's shook Daniel's hand, and then looked at me with the gentle sorrow people use when they believe money has gone with the dead. By the time I reached the front pew, I understood something with a clarity so clean it almost steadied me. They weren't mourning Richard. Not really. Not the way I was. They were measuring the damage. Measuring me. Measuring what I might cost, what I might need, how far I might fall now that the man beside me was gone. And because they had already decided I was a burden, they had started treating me like one before the service had even begun. I folded my gloves neatly into my lap and looked at the closed casket draped in white roses, then at the family gathered around it like silent shareholders waiting for a report. Let them think what they wanted. Let them arrange the chairs, lower their voices, and perform their concern. I had not come there to fight for a seat in my own life. I had come to say goodbye to my husband. And before that day was over, every person in that room was going to learn how dangerous it is to mistake dignity for weakness. The minister had not yet stepped to the front when Vanessa leaned across the aisle and moved the small printed program from my seat to the empty chair beside me, as if even paper needed better placement than I did. It was such a tiny gesture that no one else would have noticed it. That was what made it cruel. Real cruelty in families is rarely loud at first. It comes dressed as efficiency. It smiles. It straightens the ribbon on a flower arrangement and quietly reminds you that the room no longer belongs to you. I sat down anyway, smoothing the skirt of my black dress with calm hands, and looked toward the casket. Richard would have noticed all of it. He noticed everything. Not because he was suspicious by nature, but because he respected details. The right tie for a meeting. The right chair for a guest. The right words for a difficult room. He used to say that respect is easiest to measure. In small things, because that is where people reveal what they really think of you. If that was true, I did not need a speech from Vanessa to know exactly where I stood. She had spent the entire morning making decisions in my presence without ever making one with me. The church music started softly, the kind of solemn piano arrangement people choose when they want grief to sound tasteful. Guests settled into the pews in a rustle of black wool and whispered condolences. I could feel eyes landing on me and sliding away again. Some of those people had been in my dining room more times than I could count. I had served them Thanksgiving turkey, lemon pound cake, coffee after board dinners, iced tea on humid July afternoons. I had listened to stories about their children, sent flowers to their mothers, remembered anniversaries they forgot themselves. Yet now the kindness in their faces had changed shape. It had become caution. People are generous when they believe you are still socially equal to them. They become delicate when they think you have dropped below the floor they stand on. An older woman named Patricia bent toward me from the next pew and squeezed my hand. "You are being so brave," she whispered, her lipstick leaving a faint mark on the edge of her tissue. "Do not worry. Daniel will make sure you are taken care of." I turned to look at her. She meant it kindly. That was the humiliation of it. Kindness can wound just as deeply when it is built on the wrong assumption. Taken care of. As though I had become an obligation before the burial had even begun. I gave her a small nod and faced forward again. 2 rows ahead, Daniel sat stiffly beside Vanessa, his shoulders tight, his jaw set. He looked like a man trying to survive a public event, not a son watching his mother be slowly erased in plain sight. I tried to remember the last time he had looked at me the way he did when he was 12 and came home from school furious because another boy had mocked my old station wagon. "Do not laugh at my mother," he had shouted then, small and red-faced and loyal in that fierce, uncomplicated way boys can be before they grow up and start borrowing their moral courage from the person they married. The minister began speaking about Richard's steadiness, his discipline, his loyalty to family. And for one brief moment, I let the words carry me somewhere private. I remembered Richard in the early mornings, standing barefoot in the kitchen with a coffee mug and the newspaper folded under one arm. I remembered the crease beside his left eye when he smiled for real. I remembered the way he used to tap my wrist twice when we sat side by side in crowded places, a quiet signal that meant, "I am here." The memory hit me, so suddenly I had to press my thumbnail into the leather of my handbag to keep my face composed. That was grief. Sharp and clean. Honest. Nothing like the other thing moving through the room. During the first hymn, I noticed Vanessa turn halfway around in her seat to catch the eye of the funeral director. She made a small motion with 2 fingers, neat and practiced, and a young man in a dark suit stepped over to the side table near the guest book where sympathy cards had been collecting all morning. He lifted the basket and carried it toward the family room and back. Vanessa nodded once, satisfied. I watched that basket leave the chapel as if I were watching a door close. Every card, every check, every handwritten note from people who had loved Richard or wished to be seen loving him was now passing through her hands first. She had not asked. She had simply taken control, Because that is what people do when they think power is available and no one strong enough remains to claim it. Then came the eulogy from Daniel. I had not seen a copy. No one had shown me one. He stood, adjusted the microphone, and cleared his throat. For a second I thought he might surprise me. I thought he might say something real. Something about the father who taught him to drive in an empty mall parking lot on icy Sunday mornings. Something about summer fishing trips, or burnt hamburgers, or the way Richard never missed a single one of his baseball games, even when work ran late. Instead, Daniel delivered a polished tribute full of polished phrases. Respected businessman, generous mentor, provider, community leader. Every sentence was smooth enough to slide across. Not one line belonged to his son. Worse than that, not one line belonged to me either. He thanked Vanessa by name for handling so many of the difficult arrangements over the past few days. He thanked family friends. He thanked the church. And when he finally mentioned me, it was with the detached kindness people use in holiday cards to distant relatives. My mother has been very emotional, of course, but we are all doing our best to support her. I felt the blood go cold in my hands. Very emotional. I had not raised my voice once. I had not cried publicly. I had not made a scene, asked a favor, or leaned on anyone's arm. But there it was, inserted gently into the record like a nail tapped into polished wood. A narrative. A role. The fragile widow. The unstable mother. The woman who would soon need management. I turned my head slightly and looked at the back of my son's neck while he spoke, searching for some trace of the boy I had once known. I found none. When he sat down, Vanessa touched his wrist with approval. Not comfort. Approval. And in that moment, clearer than the church windows in the morning sun, I understood that none of this was accidental. They had not merely failed to defend me. They had built the frame around me themselves. I lowered my gaze to the folded program in my lap and traced Richard's name with the tip of one finger. Let them keep performing. Let them keep arranging the room. There are people who mistake a quiet woman for a powerless one, and they always look most certain right before they learn the difference. After the service ended, people rose in slow, careful waves, the way they always do when they are leaving a church and trying to look respectful on the way out. The organ faded into silence. Programs folded shut. Shoes whispered against polished wood. For a few seconds the room held that strange pause between ceremony and appetite, when grief is still expected, but everyone is already thinking about coffee, sandwiches, and who will stand with whom at the reception. I stayed seated until the pews around me had thinned, one hand resting lightly on my handbag, the other on the edge of the bench Richard, and I should have walked away from together years from now. Not like this, not with me alone, and being watched as if I were an unanswered question. Daniel and Vanessa remained near the front, accepting condolences with the solemn confidence of people who had already decided they were now the official face of the family. Vanessa wore sympathy beautifully. She tilted her head at exactly the right angle. She pressed fingers to forearms, lowered her lashes, and let her voice soften into that breathy register women use when they want to sound tender without losing control. I had seen her perform concern before. At hospital visits. At holiday dinners. At charity luncheons where she wanted people to leave thinking she was both graceful and indispensable. The difference now was that she was performing over my husband's coffin, and no one seemed to find that strange. When I finally stood, my knees complained the way they do in cold weather, and I paused a moment to steady myself. That was all it took. A family friend named Mark, one of Richard's old golf partners, hurried toward me with the strained expression people wear when they are trying to be noble. "Easy there, Evelyn," he said, already reaching for my elbow. "Let us get you to the reception room. There is no need for you to worry about anything today." I looked at his hand before I looked at his face. He drew it back, embarrassed, but only slightly. He still thought he was helping. "I know where the reception room is," I said. My tone was polite, not sharp, but something in it made him blink. "Of course," he murmured, stepping aside. The hallway to the fellowship room smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish. Framed photographs of former pastors lined the walls, all solemn men in dark suits who had probably never imagined a widow could be quietly pushed out of her own place in a family before the potato salad was even served. The reception had been set up with white tablecloths, silver coffee urns, trays of sandwiches with the crusts trimmed off, fruit, pound cake, and those pale little mince churches seemed to keep an endless supply. I noticed immediately that the head table had only 4 reserved place cards. Daniel, Vanessa, Pastor Green, and Mr. Halpern, Richard's law partner from years ago. My place card sat at a round table off to the side near Patricia and 2 women from the neighborhood. Bridge Club, not beside my son, not near the front, not even next to Richard's oldest friends. Just near enough to be seen, but far enough to be managed. I stood there with my gloves in one hand, staring at the card with my name printed neatly on cream stock, and I felt something inside me settle into a colder shape. A younger woman might have marched straight to Vanessa and demanded an explanation. A louder woman might have drawn half the room into the scene. I did neither. There is a particular kind of power that comes with age when you stop confusing reaction with strength. I simply picked up the place card, set it face down, and took the chair anyway. Across the room, Vanessa noticed. Our eyes met for one brief second. She smiled. It was a small smile, almost invisible. Not friendly. Not embarrassed. Triumphant. As if she believed the room had already absorbed its lesson and that I would now cooperate with the role assigned to me. Around me, conversation rose in careful little clusters. Such a lovely service. Richard would have been proud. Daniel spoke beautifully. Vanessa has done an incredible job. That last sentence floated past me 3 different times in under 5 minutes. She was collecting credit like a woman filling a basket at a market. I poured myself coffee and realized someone had switched the regular roast Richard always preferred for a flavored blend with vanilla. It was almost funny. Even dead, he was being redecorated. Patricia sat beside me and began speaking in the confidential tone people use when they are about to say something intrusive and believe tenderness will excuse it. I hope you are not thinking too far ahead yet, she said. These things can be so overwhelming. The house alone must feel like a lot now. I turned to her slowly. The house feels like my house, I said. She gave a tight little smile and busied herself with a napkin. At the buffet table, Daniel laughed softly at something Mr. Halpern said. Laughed. Not loudly, not inappropriately enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for me to notice the ease in it. Enough for me to feel how separate he had already made himself from me. He had crossed some invisible line in the last week, from son to administrator, from family to observer. He looked at me now the way young executives look at old furniture in a lobby. Still present, still technically part of the property, but clearly not central to the future design. Then I heard Vanessa say my name. She was standing near the coffee service with 2 women from the church and a cousin of Richard's I had not seen in years. She did not lower her voice. We are just trying to make things simpler for Evelyn, she said, stirring cream into her cup. She has had a very sheltered life, and there is going to be a lot for her to figure out now. Sheltered. One word. That was all. One soft word delivered with sympathy and perfect timing. And suddenly, I could feel half the room listening without appearing to. Sheltered. As if I had not balanced books, hosted clients, negotiated contractors, managed estates after both my parents died, sat beside Richard through expansion years, recession years, and the year his largest deal nearly collapsed, and he admitted to me at 2 in the morning that he trusted my judgment more than his own partner's. Sheltered. It was so absurd I nearly smiled. Instead I lifted my coffee, took one measured sip, and set the cup down with care. Vanessa had made a mistake. A small one, perhaps, but real. Up until then they had all been working in hints and gestures, allowing humiliation to hide under concern. But that word gave the game away. It was not grief guiding the room. It was positioning. They were not comforting me. They were defining me downward, one polite sentence at a time, so that when the real conversations began, everyone would already know where I belonged. I folded my gloves over each other and watched my son stand beside his wife without correcting a single word. That was when the last piece clicked into place. This was not simply Vanessa taking over because she was controlling by nature. Daniel had let her. Daniel had agreed. Somewhere in the private space between Richard's death and this reception, they had built a story about me and handed it to the room. Frail. Emotional. Sheltered. A woman to be handled. A woman to be guided. A woman who should be grateful for whatever arrangement came next. And because they believed I did not know what they were doing, they were growing careless. Careless people always do. They start speaking too soon. They start managing details that do not belong to them. They start looking relieved before the matter is settled. I sat very still in that bright church hall with its silver coffee urns and white sheet cake, and all its polished, practiced sympathy, and for the first time that day, I felt something close to calm. Let them keep talking. Let them keep underestimating me. Every assumption they made was giving me something I could use later. By then the room had settled into its rhythm, the careful one people adopt when they want to eat, talk, and still appear respectful. Coffee cups clinked softly against saucers. Someone laughed too quickly and then lowered their voice as if volume alone could restore dignity. The pastor stood near the far wall speaking to an elderly couple from the church, and Daniel had drifted toward Richard's former colleagues with the grave, measured expression of a man already rehearsing how to inherit a role he had not earned. I remained seated for another minute, not because I was unsure of myself, but because stillness reveals more than movement ever does. People talk more freely when they think you are too wounded to notice. They assume grief makes a woman foggy. They assume age makes her slow. They assume silence means surrender. They are almost always wrong. A volunteer from the church refilled the water pitcher on my table and gave me that same softened look I had been seeing all day. "Let me know if you need anything," she said. "We all want to make this easier on you." Easier. There it was again. That language of gentle management. They did not see me as the woman who had lived beside Richard for more than 4 decades. They saw a transition problem. Something delicate to move from one arrangement to the next. I thanked her and rose from my chair, taking my gloves and handbag with me. Across the room, on a long side table near the wall, envelopes and sympathy cards had been placed in neat stacks beside a silver pen tray. I had noticed them earlier when the basket was carried out of the chapel, and now I noticed something else. A legal-size manila folder lay half-hidden beneath a white linen napkin, the corner just visible under a tray of folded thank you cards. Vanessa was standing nearby, speaking to Mr. Halpern in a voice too low to catch clearly, but I saw her hand slide toward the folder once, then stop when she noticed me looking in that direction. She smiled again. Always that polished little smile. It was becoming less impressive each time I saw it. I walked toward the coffee service instead, slow and unhurried, and let my eyes travel the room the way Richard used to when he entered a negotiation he knew other people thought was social. The trick was not to stare at what mattered. It was to notice everything else around it first. Mr. Halpern stood with his back half turned to the room, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other holding a paper cup he was not drinking from. He had known Richard for 30 years. I did not dislike him, but I had never trusted him to separate loyalty from convenience. He caught sight of me and gave a brief nod. "Evelyn," he said, holding up. "There are questions people ask when they do not want the answer." "Well enough," I replied. "You and Vanessa seem busy." Something flickered in his face, then disappeared. "There are always details after a service," he said. "Best to keep things orderly." Orderly. Another useful word. I let it pass. "I imagine there are," I said. Richard always preferred details handled carefully. Mr. Halpern's fingers tightened once around the cup. It was small. Most people would have missed it. I did not. Vanessa stepped in then, smooth as ever. "We are just trying to stay ahead of things," she said. "You do not need to concern yourself with any of this today." There was a peach-colored lipstick stain on the rim of her coffee cup. Her diamond bracelet flashed when she tucked a strand of hair behind one ear. Even at a funeral reception, she looked curated. "That is kind of you," I said, although I have never had much trouble concerning myself with my own affairs. Mr. Halpern glanced down. Vanessa gave a soft laugh, the kind women use when they want to suggest you are being difficult without sounding rude. "Of course," she said. "I only meant paperwork can be confusing at a time like this." Confusing. I almost admired the discipline of it. Every word chosen to imply incapacity without ever fully stating it. Sheltered. Emotional. Easier. Confusing. It was a latticework of condescension, delicate enough to pass for concern if anyone later chose to deny it. I took a fresh cup from the stack and poured myself coffee. "Strange," I said lightly. "Richard always told me paperwork is easiest when you know where everything is." Vanessa's fingers paused on her cup. Only for a second, but long enough. There it was. Not proof. Not yet. Just a tremor. The sign of a person who had expected a softer target. I added 1 packet of sugar, though I did not want it, and stirred slowly. Behind us, 2 women from the neighborhood were discussing who had brought the lemon bars. Someone at another table was explaining to a cousin from Ohio that the weather had turned early this year. Ordinary sounds. Harmless sounds. Yet beneath them ran another current entirely, The private machinery of family power shifting in real time. I looked once more toward the side table. The manila folder was gone. Has Daniel had a chance to eat? I asked, as if that were what mattered to me in the moment. Vanessa relaxed a fraction. Not yet, she said. He has had so much on his mind. She said it possessively, as though grief itself now belonged to the two of them, and I was merely adjacent to it. I am sure he has, I replied. Then I turned away before either of them could add another layer of polite dismissal. I did not need more. I had enough already. Enough to see that something was moving behind the public performance. Enough to know they were speaking to lawyers without me, handling papers without me, and shaping a version of events in which I was too bereaved, too overwhelmed, too dependent to question anything until it was already arranged. At another time in my life, that realization might have shaken me. It did not now. Age strips many illusions away, but one gift it offers in return is pattern recognition. I had seen this kind of confidence before. In dinner guests who assumed Richard's success meant I did not understand business. In younger couples who mistook graciousness for passivity. In men who explained contracts to me in slow voices and later regretted it. The details here were different, but the structure was the same. They believed they were ahead because they had moved first. They believed I was behind because I had not objected. They believed access was the same as authority. And they believed the story they were telling the room had already become truth. That was their real mistake. Stories only harden into facts when no one withstanding contradicts them. I set my spoon down on the saucer and lifted the cup to my lips, keeping my expression calm. Richard had left me many things. Habits, memories, warnings, instructions, and one lesson above all. Never interrupt your opponents when they are showing you exactly how far they are willing to go. So I let the room go on talking. I let Vanessa keep smiling. I let Daniel keep his distance. And all the while, piece by piece, I began fitting together the shape of what they thought they could do before I decided it was time to speak. By the time the reception had been underway for nearly half an hour, the room had become easier to read. The first layer of grief had worn off. People had eaten enough to relax into themselves. And when people relax, they stop guarding their instincts. Conversations widened. Chairs shifted. Sympathy began blending into curiosity, and curiosity has a sound all its own. It is softer than gossip, quieter than judgment, but it carries farther than either. I could hear it in the pauses between sentences, in the lowered voices, in the way certain eyes returned to me again and again as though I were the one unfinished matter left in the room. Vanessa, meanwhile, had grown bolder. There is something dangerous about a person who mistakes social control for moral authority. Once they believe the room is with them, they begin to test how far they can go. She had been moving from table to table with a plate she barely touched, offering thanks, accepting compliments, and speaking in that careful polished tone that made everything sound thoughtful even when it was calculated. Daniel followed her rhythm now, not mine. He stood where she stood, nodded when she nodded, and absorbed the kind of approval that can make weak people feel taller than they are. I watched them from my chair with my coffee cooling untouched beside me and thought, not for the first time that day, how quickly some people reorganize the living once the dead can no longer. Object. A cousin of Richard sat down across from me and began telling me how lovely the flowers were. I thanked her. Patricia asked whether I had eaten enough. I told her I was fine. Mark returned to say something about the weather turning colder by the weekend, as if meteorology could soften humiliation. Through it all, I kept my tone even and my hands still. It unnerved people more than tears would have. They wanted signs that their assumptions were correct. They wanted trembling, confusion, some visible surrender they could gather around and call compassion. Instead, I gave them composure. And composure in an older woman is often treated as defiance by those who were hoping for dependence. Then Vanessa made her move. She was standing near the center of the room beside the dessert table, one hand resting on the back of Daniel's chair, the other holding a small paper cup. Several people had gathered around her, including Patricia, Mr. Halpern, 2 women from the church committee, and one of Richard's former clients, a man named Stephen who had always spoken too loudly in quiet rooms. Someone asked whether I would be staying in the house. It was not asked to me, of course. Questions about a widow are often directed to the nearest person who seems more official. Vanessa gave a sympathetic smile and let out the faintest breath before answering. We are going to help Evelyn figure out what makes sense financially, she said. Her voice was calm, warm, almost tender. A house that size can become a burden when you are alone, and I think downsizing may actually be a relief for her. For one suspended second, the room did not move. It did not stop completely, but it thinned, as if all the sound had stepped back to make space for that sentence to land. I set my cup down very carefully. There are insults so plain they scarcely require interpretation, and there are others crafted to survive scrutiny, wrapped in concern, polished until they can pass for kindness. This one was the second kind. That made it worse. She had not simply implied that I was unable to manage my own life. She had announced it to the room as though the decision were already underway. A burden. Downsizing. Relief. Every word chosen to shrink me while appearing helpful. Stephen gave an awkward little nod, eager to belong to whatever the correct reaction was. Patricia looked at her hands. Mr. Halpern stared into his coffee. Daniel, my own son, did not say a word. Not one. He stood there in his black suit with his father scarcely buried, and let his wife talk about my life as though I were already halfway removed from it. That silence told me more than any argument could have. People think betrayal always arrives dramatically. It does not. Sometimes it arrives as permission. Sometimes it is simply the moment the person who should have spoken decides not to. I rose from my chair. No rush. No scraping legs against the floor. Just one controlled movement, enough to make a few nearby conversations falter. I picked up my gloves from the table and smoothed one fingertip over the leather. Vanessa turned toward me, and I saw it then, clear as daylight. Not guilt. Not even embarrassment. Expectation. She expected pain. Perhaps tears. Perhaps a brittle protest she could calm with that practiced smile of hers. Perhaps a scene she could later describe as unfortunate proof that I was not handling things well. What she did not expect was composure. That is thoughtful of you, Vanessa, I said. My voice carried exactly as far as it needed to. Not loud. Just clear. A few more heads turned. But I have never found my own home to be a burden. No one moved. Vanessa's smile held, but just barely. I only meant, she began, that after a loss like this, practical changes can make life easier. Easier again. There was that word. Always easier. As though my life were a piece of furniture they hoped to lift while I was too dazed to object. I looked at Daniel then, not because I needed help, but because I wanted him to understand I was seeing him fully. Did you know your wife was making housing plans for me? I asked. It was the first direct question I had put to him all day. His face shifted, only slightly. Mom, no one is making plans, he said quickly. We are just trying to think ahead. Think ahead. That was rich. They had been thinking ahead all morning, and none of their thoughts had included my consent. I let the silence sit for a moment after his answer. Silence is useful that way. It forces weak explanations to echo longer than the speaker intended. Around us, people suddenly found great interest in their plates, their napkins, the coffee urn, anything but the truth standing in front of them. Vanessa gave a soft laugh meant to restore the social temperature. We all want what is best for you, she said. That was the sentence. Not the first one, though it was close. This one, because hidden inside it was the final assumption, the one beneath all the others. That they knew what was best for me. That my future belonged in their mouths before it belonged in my hands. I could feel Richard beside me in memory then, not as sentiment, but as steadiness. The way he used to go quiet before correcting someone who had made the mistake of speaking with confidence before checking the facts. He never rushed those moments. Neither would I. I picked up my cup again, took one measured sip, and set it down. That must be comforting for you, I said, meeting Vanessa's eyes. To feel so certain. The room went still in a different way then. Not the stunned stillness after an insult, but the sharper kind that comes when people realize the person they underestimated has not only understood the game, but declined the role assigned to them. Vanessa's expression did not crack, but it tightened at the edges. Daniel looked away first. Of course he did. In that single exchange, the air in the room changed. Not fully. Not enough to undo what had already been exposed. But enough for people to sense that what they had accepted as settled might not be settled at all. Enough for them to wonder whether the woman they had quietly pitted all afternoon was, in fact, the only person in the room who still knew exactly where she stood. The effect of that exchange did not fade. It lingered over the room like the last note of a hymn, invisible but impossible to ignore. People resumed talking, but the tone had changed. Conversations grew more careful. I shifted differently now. Until that moment, they had all been participating in the same quiet assumption, some more eagerly than others, that I was drifting into dependence, and that Vanessa and Daniel were simply helping manage the transition. But certainty is a fragile thing. Once cracked, it never fits back together neatly. I returned to my seat without hurry and folded my gloves across my lap again. My coffee had gone lukewarm. I drank it anyway. Across the room, Vanessa was smiling at someone from the church committee, but the smile no longer had the same ease. Daniel had moved away from her for the first time all afternoon and was speaking to Mr. Halper near the windows, his posture too stiff to suggest comfort. Good. Discomfort has a way of loosening truth. I did not intend to confront either of them again just yet. There is no reason to rush a room once it has started revealing itself. The best thing you can do, sometimes, is let people try to recover their balance while knowing they no longer have the ground they thought they did. Patricia leaned toward me after a few minutes and gave a little nervous smile. I am sure Vanessa meant well, she said, because there is always someone willing to translate rudeness into concern if the speaker is young, polished, and socially useful. Of course, I said. People often do. That ended the conversation better than any sharper response would have. She looked at her plate and did not attempt to help me interpret my own life again. At the far side of the room, a volunteer replenished the trays of sandwiches. A little boy, perhaps a grandson of one of Richard's clients, was scolded gently for running too fast between tables. Someone opened the fellowship hall door, and a draft of cold air slipped in from the hallway. All of it ordinary. All of it almost absurdly normal against the private shift happening inside me. Because while the room was busy recalculating its impression of me, I had already moved on to something else entirely. I was no longer thinking only about offense. I was thinking about sequence. About what had happened in the days before the service. About the way Vanessa had taken hold of details that did not belong to her. About the folder on the side table. About Mr. Halpern's careful phrasing. About Daniel's rehearsed distance. About the words sheltered and emotional and easier and practical. Each placed like stepping stones across a river they expected me to cross without looking down. Richard had always said that when people begin preparing language before they prepare facts, it means they know the facts are not on their side. That memory came back to me then with surprising force. Not because I suddenly missed him more than I already did. That ache had been constant all day, a steady bruise beneath everything else. No, it came back because I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing beside my chair. Not sentimental, not dreamy, but exact. Never let anyone rush you after a death, Evelyn. That was what he had said after my mother passed away 12 years earlier, when a cousin I barely knew had started making suggestions about jewelry, furniture, and keeping things simple. Grief creates opportunities for opportunists. Slow everything down. I had listened then. I was listening now. And as I sat in that church hall with my back straight and my expression composed, I found myself remembering another conversation, one from late summer, just 8 weeks before Richard died. We had been on the back patio after dinner. The heat had finally broken, and the evening air carried that clean September edge that makes even expensive houses feel temporary. Richard had loosened his tie and set his glass of iced tea on the table between us. He looked tired that night, more tired than he admitted, though I had known him long enough to read the shadows in his face better than he could hide them. If anything happens sooner than we expect, he had said, not looking at me at first, I need you to promise me 2 things. I had laughed softly then, because after 42 years of marriage there is something almost ridiculous about hearing your husband introduce a sentence like that. You are not going anywhere, I told him. Probably not tonight, he said, with that dry half-smile of his. Then he turned serious. Still, promise me. I remember setting my glass down. I remember the cicadas humming in the yard. I remember the porch light catching the silver in his hair. All right, I said. What 2 things? He had leaned back in his chair and folded one hand over the other, the way he did when he wanted me to hear the structure of what he was saying. First, do not let anyone make you feel confused on purpose. If people start talking too fast or using too many soft words, that is not kindness. That is strategy. Even then, I had smiled. You make it sound as though I am likely to be ambushed at a garden club luncheon. You would be surprised where greed puts on good manners, he had said. Then he gave me the second instruction. And do not tell anyone more than they need to know until you know exactly who they are being. At the time, I had understood the practical side of it. Richard had always been private about money. Not secretive in a theatrical sense, just disciplined. He believed wealth should create security, not performance. We lived well, certainly, but not noisily. We gave generously, but selectively. We did not confuse visible spending with actual power. Daniel had grown up in comfort. Yet even he had never been told the full architecture of his father's finances. Richard did not believe adult children were entitled to numbers simply because they shared a last name. He believed entitlement, once fed, rarely stops eating. I had not argued with him then. I did not argue now. Because that conversation, remembered in the middle of lukewarm coffee and white tablecloths and polished condolences, suddenly fit over the day like a key sliding into a lock. They were using soft words. They were moving fast, and they clearly believed I did not know enough to stop them. A strange calm came over me then, the kind that arrives when memory stops being wistful and becomes useful. I looked toward Daniel near the windows and remembered him at 17, asking his father why privacy mattered so much. Richard had answered without even looking up from the paper in his hands. Because the minute people think they understand the extent of what you have, they stop revealing the extent of who they are. I had thought it severe at the time, perhaps even a little cynical. Standing in that reception hall, I realized it was neither. It was simply experience made concise. And the hardest part of the realization was not that Vanessa had shown herself. It was that Daniel had done the same. He knew enough to know better. He knew me well enough to understand I was not helpless, not forgetful, not incapable of handling my own affairs. Which meant his silence was not confusion. It was cooperation. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. One cuts the skin, the other reaches bone. I let my gaze rest on him for only a second before looking away. There would be time later to account for that pain. For now, pain was less useful than clarity. And clarity told me this. Richard had prepared me for exactly this kind of day. Not by leaving me trembling over files and signatures, but by making certain I understood what mattered, where it was, and when to remain silent. They thought my silence meant weakness. In truth, it was the only advantage in the room that still belonged entirely to me. After that, I stopped trying to measure the room by what people were saying and began measuring it by what they were willing to keep saying in front of me. That is a different kind of accounting. Harder at first, more accurate in the end. Once people decide you are harmless, they become astonishingly careless. They do not lower their voices enough. They let their sympathy harden into planning. They start speaking as though your future has already been discussed elsewhere and only requires your quiet cooperation to become official. I stayed where I was and gave them every chance to continue. Vanessa accepted another round of praise for holding everything together. Daniel nodded at the right moments and kept one hand in his pocket, which he has done since boyhood, whenever he wanted to look more confident than he felt. Mr. Halpern drifted between tables with the distracted air of a man who would have preferred documents to emotions. It was almost enough to make the afternoon look ordinary from a distance. But the closer one listened, the more obvious the pattern became. Vanessa began using the language of arrangement now, not just concern. She spoke about next steps, about timing, about how exhausting large homes can be after a loss, about how some decisions are easier when made quickly. She said these things to other people, not to me. That was the point. She was not trying to persuade me. She was trying to prepare the room. She wanted witnesses to an idea before she wanted my response to it. If enough people heard the same version first, then later resistance could be framed as denial, confusion, emotion. It was clever in a narrow way. The kind of cleverness that works best on people who have never met real discipline. A woman from Richard's old board sat down beside me and touched my wrist lightly. "You must let them help," she said. "It is a blessing to have younger people around at a time like this." I looked at her hand until she removed it. "Blessings are easier to recognize when they are invited," I said. She gave a startled little laugh and stood up soon after. That, too, was useful. The room was learning that I was not drifting. I was listening. A few minutes later, Daniel came over at last, carrying a paper napkin he did not seem to know what to do with. He stood beside my chair instead of sitting, which told me immediately that he did not intend a real conversation. He intended maintenance. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think Vanessa is only trying to ease the pressure on you." There it was again. Always Vanessa trying. Always me receiving. Never anyone asking whether pressure existed at all, or who was creating it. I folded my gloves once more along the seams. Is that what you think this is? I asked. He glanced across the room toward his wife before answering. Not at me. Toward her. That small movement said more than his words would have. I think today has been hard on everyone, he said. People are doing their best. It was the kind of sentence men use when they are too weak to name the truth and too embarrassed to defend the lie directly. I studied his face. My son had Richard's height, my father's chin, and none of the steadiness either man would have shown me in that moment. Your best used to look different, I said. Not cruelly. Just plainly. Color rose at his collar. For 1 second, I thought I saw something close to shame. Then Vanessa appeared beside him, smooth and immediate, as though she had been watching for the first sign of unscripted feeling. Daniel, Mr. Halpern was asking about the memorial envelopes, she said, placing a hand lightly on his arm. Then she turned to me with that same bright sympathy she had been wearing all day. We are just trying to make sure nothing gets misplaced. I let a beat pass. How reassuring, I said. Especially for the people those envelopes were intended for. Her smile thinned. Daniel muttered something about checking on the pastor and stepped away. He left too quickly. He always did that when a conversation required him to choose between honesty and convenience. Vanessa remained standing there, one hand still resting against the side of his empty chair. You seem upset with me, she said softly, as if she were offering me the chance to confess to an overreaction. Not upset, I replied. Interested. That word landed better than anger would have. She blinked. Interested in what? In what gives you the confidence to discuss my future as though I have already handed it over? The room was not silent, but it was listening. I could feel that peculiar shift again, the one that happens when conversation in one corner becomes more important than the sentences elsewhere. Vanessa lowered her voice by half a degree, which only made people strain harder without seeming to. No one is taking anything from you, she said. We are trying to prevent you from being overwhelmed. By my own life? I asked. There is a way to ask a question that makes an answer impossible without exposing the speaker. Richard was excellent at it. I learned from the best. Vanessa gave a tiny laugh and looked down briefly, buying herself a second. You are grieving, she said. That changes what people can manage. There it was. The room had been circling that claim all afternoon. She had finally said it plainly enough to be useful. I stood then, not abruptly, just firmly enough that she had to shift her weight back. Several conversations faltered. I could see Patricia freeze mid-sip. Mr. Halpern turned from the window. Even the little boy who had been scolded earlier stopped tapping a plastic spoon on the edge of his plate. You should be careful, Vanessa, I said, my voice even and low, not to confuse grief with incapacity. No one moved. Vanessa's expression held, but only through effort. I did not mean it that way. I know, I said. That is what makes it so revealing. For the first time all day, she had no immediate sentence ready. She was used to rooms where politeness did half her work for her. She was used to implication going unchallenged because older women are expected to preserve harmony even when harmony has been built on their humiliation. Daniel had counted on that. So had she. They had mistaken my manners for surrender, my mourning for weakness, my silence for vacancy. That is a common error among people who inherit comfort without understanding the discipline that built it. I let the moment breathe, not because I needed drama, but because the truth deserves space once it finally enters a room. Then I reached for my handbag, slipped on one glove, then the other, and looked from Vanessa to Daniel, who had stopped halfway back toward us, and now stood frozen with the look of a man who realized the afternoon was no longer following the script he had chosen. Good. Let him feel that. Let him stand in it. I think, I said, speaking clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear without raising my voice at all, that before anyone else makes another helpful suggestion about what I can or cannot manage, there is something this room ought to understand. And with that, I saw it happen. The last little mask of certainty fell away from both of them at once. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the church kitchen door and the soft ticking of the wall clock above the coat rack. It is remarkable how quickly a room full of adults can become still when money is about to change the meaning of everything they thought they understood. I did not enjoy that silence. I did not fear it either. I simply stood inside it and let it do its work. Vanessa was the first to recover enough to speak. "Evelyn," she said, and for the first time all day my name sounded slightly strained in her mouth. "Maybe this is not the moment." I turned my head and looked at her fully. "No," I said. "This is exactly the moment. Because all afternoon people have been speaking as though I am one difficult invoice away from needing supervision, and I would rather correct that while Richard's friends are still here to hear it." No one made a sound. Daniel stepped forward then, one hand half raised, not in authority but in caution, as though he suddenly understood that whatever happened next was no longer something he could smooth over afterward. "Mom," he said, keeping his voice low, "you do not have to do this here." "Do what?" I asked. "Speak accurately." He stopped. That is the trouble with telling partial truths for too long. A direct question can turn them to dust. I looked around the room, at the white tablecloths, the untouched slices of pound cake, the women with napkins folded neatly in their laps, the men pretending not to stare, the pastor standing still with his hands loosely clasped. Then I spoke the way Richard used to when he wanted a fact placed on the table with no room left around it for interpretation. "I am not financially vulnerable," I said. "I am not confused about my affairs. I am not waiting for someone else to decide whether I can remain in my own home. And since that seems to have been a matter of discussion today, let me save everyone the trouble of speculating." I paused just long enough to feel the attention tighten. I control a little over $28 million in assets. If someone had dropped a tray, it could not have changed the room more. I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize the number. I simply said it, and let the truth strike where it would. Patricia's mouth parted. Stephen actually blinked twice, as though his eyes needed help processing what his ears had just done. Mr. Halpern looked down first, which told me two things at once. He had known enough to suspect the scale, and he had also known enough to understand exactly what this meant for the story Vanessa had been telling. Daniel went pale in a way I had not seen since he was 14 and backed the car into the mailbox. Vanessa did not pale. She tightened. Her whole face seemed to draw inward by a fraction, the way expensive fabric pulls at the seams when forced too sharply. "That is not," she began, then stopped, recalculating. "I do not think personal finances need to be discussed in a public setting. Neither do my living arrangements," I said. "And yet here we are." A sound moved through the room then. Not a gasp exactly, more the quiet shifting sound of people realizing they had stood too close to the wrong version of events. I could feel it in the air, that social withdrawal, subtle but immediate. The same people who had nodded along to words like easier and practical and burden were now revising the afternoon in their minds, searching for where concern had ended and presumption had begun. That is the problem with underestimating a quiet woman in public. When the truth arrives, it does not only expose your intentions to her, it exposes them to everyone who watched you perform them. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, no one was saying you were broke." It was a foolish sentence, and he knew it even as he spoke it. Too narrow. Too late. "No," I said. "You were more polished than that." His face flushed. Vanessa folded her arms lightly, then seemed to think better of it and let them fall again. She was still trying to look composed, but composure built on control rarely survives the loss of it. "You are misunderstanding the spirit of what everyone was trying to do," she said. Spirit. Another soft word. Another curtain. I almost admired her commitment to the technique. "On the contrary," I replied. "I understood it perfectly. That is why I waited." Her eyes narrowed just slightly. That was new. She had stopped performing tenderness and started defending territory. Good. Better to see the real shape of a person before the day is over. I shifted my attention to the rest of the room. "My husband believed in privacy," I said. "He also believed that privacy is useful because it lets people reveal themselves before they know what is at stake. I never mentioned the full extent of my finances because it was never anyone's business. But today made something very clear to me. Some people here were not responding to my grief. They were responding to what they assumed my vulnerability would make possible." No one interrupted. Not the pastor. Not Patricia. Not even Stephen, who looked as though he would have preferred to sink directly into the church carpeting. Mr. Halpern set his untouched coffee cup down on the nearest table and straightened, finally forced into the discomfort he had hoped to avoid all afternoon. Daniel tried one last time. "That is not fair," he said, but there was no force in it now. Only embarrassment. "Fair," I repeated. Your wife discussed downsizing me at your father's funeral reception. He opened his mouth and then closed it. Vanessa stepped in immediately. I was trying to make sure you did not get overwhelmed by responsibilities you should not have to carry alone. Responsibilities I have been carrying longer than you have been alive. I asked. That landed. I saw it land. The churchwoman looked down. Stephen turned away and busied himself with a napkin. Patricia pressed her lips together in a line that suggested, at last, not pity but shame. I did not feel triumphant. That is important. I was not enjoying the number itself, or the discomfort it caused. Money, by itself, is rarely the point in moments like these. The point is revelation. The point is that $28 million had not changed my character in the last 60 seconds. It had only changed their behavior toward the truth of who I already was. I was the same woman I had been when I walked into that chapel. The same woman they had quietly placed at a side table. The same woman they had discussed like a transitional burden. The only difference now was that their assumptions had become impossible to defend without admitting what had shaped them. I let the silence settle once more, then smoothed the cuff of my glove and spoke in the calmest voice I had used all day. The money is not the insult, I said. The insult is that some of you decided my value could be measured by whether you thought I had it. And there it was. The true sentence. The one beneath all the others. I could see from the faces around me that they understood it too. No one spoke after that. Not right away. The room seemed to contract around its own discomfort. Every polished surface suddenly too bright. Every white tablecloth too clean for what had just been exposed across it. The wall clock continued ticking above the coat rack as though time had no interest in waiting for shame to settle. I stood where I was with my gloves on and my handbag resting lightly against my wrist, and I understood something with a clarity that felt almost merciful. I did not need another explanation. I did not need one apology arranged in prettier language than the insult that came before it. I did not need Daniel to find the right sentence at last, or Vanessa to rediscover humility in a room that no longer admired her poise. Some days do not end with understanding. Some days end with revelation, and revelation is enough. Pastor Green was the first to move. He stepped forward with the measured caution of a man who had presided over enough. Funerals to know that grief often uncovers truths the living had hoped to postpone. Mrs. Carter, he said softly, I am sorry for anything today that added to your burden. I looked at him and inclined my head. It mattered that he had chosen burden carefully, not as a description of me, but of what had been placed on me. Thank you, I said. That is more grace than this day deserved. He lowered his eyes for a moment and stepped back. Around us, guests began making the small practical motions people make when they want to leave a room without appearing to flee it. Napkins were folded. Chairs shifted. Coffee cups were abandoned half full. The social temperature had changed, and everyone could feel it. Vanessa remained very still, but her stillness was no longer elegant. It was defensive, the kind that comes when a person realizes charm has stopped protecting them. Daniel looked at me once, then away, then back again, as though hoping my face might offer him an easier version of what he had done. It did not. I gave him the truth instead. Quietly. Fully. He would have to live with that. Mom, he said at last, and his voice sounded younger than it had all day. Younger and less certain. Can we talk privately for a minute? There it was. The request people make after they have tried to shape the public version and lost control of it. Privacy suddenly becomes very important to those who were comfortable humiliating you in front of witnesses. I held his gaze. No, I said. Not harshly. Not dramatically. Just no. He swallowed. Vanessa stepped toward him, perhaps to steady him, perhaps to steady herself. I no longer cared which. This has all become very emotional, she said, attempting one final rearrangement of the truth. I think it would be better to discuss family matters later. I turned to her with more calm than she deserved. You should have considered that before making my life a topic over coffee and pound cake. A few people lowered their eyes. One of the church women actually winced. Good. Let the sentence sit where her performance had been. Let them all hear the shape of the thing without lace around it. Daniel exhaled through his nose and looked down at his hands. For the first time all afternoon, he looked like a man who understood that consequences do not always arrive in legal documents or bank balances. Sometimes they arrive as the permanent loss of moral standing in the eyes of the one person whose respect you assumed would survive anything. That was where he stood now. Not disinherited in some theatrical sense. Something quieter than that. Something he might feel for years in moments no one else would see. Holidays. Phone calls. Silences. The knowledge that when his father was laid to rest, he chose convenience over character. I did not need to punish him loudly. He had already been measured, and he knew it. I looked once around the room, at Richard's former colleagues, our neighbors, the women from church, the distant cousins, the old family friends who had watched this afternoon unfold in layers. I love my husband very much, I said, and my voice softened for the first time because that part was for Richard, not for them. He built his life with care. He trusted slowly. He paid attention to character. I intend to honor that. No one interrupted. Even Vanessa knew better now. So let me be clear. I continued. Anyone who looked at me today and saw a problem to be managed rather than a wife burying her husband has told me exactly where they belong in my life from this day forward. That was the line. Not a threat. Not a grand declaration. Just a boundary spoken in the open air where everyone could understand it. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Vanessa's chin lifted, the reflex of a woman who still wanted dignity after spending the day trying to steal mine. Mr. Halpern took one step back, as though distance might spare him from being counted among the people who had remained conveniently silent. Perhaps it would not. Perhaps it should not. I reached for the back of the chair beside me, not because I needed support, but because the movement gave me a second to steady the ache that rose unexpectedly in my chest. Not anger. Not triumph. Grief, finally, pure and unshared. Richard was gone. That was the center of everything. Under the insult, beneath the revelation, below the money and the judgment and the brittle social panic, there remained the simplest and hardest fact of all. My husband was gone, and this was the afternoon I had been given to say goodbye. They had made it uglier than it should have been. I would not let them take the rest of it too. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair and slipped it on carefully. The fabric felt heavier than it had that morning. Or perhaps I was simply more tired. Patricia stepped toward me, then stopped, clearly unsure whether comfort from her would be welcome now. It would not. Not because I hated her. Because I had no room left for witnesses who only found clarity after the number was spoken. I gave her a brief nod anyway. Enough to be civil. Nothing more. Then I turned to Daniel one last time. You may call me when you are ready to speak honestly, I said. Not before. He opened his mouth as if to answer, but no answer came. Good. Honesty should cost him enough that he has to search for it. As for Vanessa, I spared her no final private exchange, no second audience, no invitation to repair the impression she had created. She had shown me who she was in the clearest possible way. A woman like that does not need confrontation repeated. She needs access removed. There is a difference. I walked toward the door without hurry, past the white flowers, past the empty dessert plates, past the sympathy cards stacked too neatly by the wall. No one tried to stop me. No one offered to help me with my coat. No one said burden or easier or practical again. The room knew better now. When I reached the threshold, I paused only once and looked back. Daniel stood near the center of the fellowship hall, not beside his wife this time, but slightly apart from everyone, like a man who had just discovered the distance between position and worth. Vanessa remained where she was, composed in posture alone. The others were already reorganizing themselves around the aftermath, careful now, quieter now, unwilling to meet one another's eyes for too long. They had all come expecting to witness a widow diminished by loss. Instead, they had witnessed something far less comfortable. They had watched the wrong woman be underestimated. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold afternoon air. It hit my face clean and sharp, carrying the faint scent of leaves and stone and the first edge of winter. For the first time that day, I could breathe without tasting performance in the room around me. I stood on the church steps for one moment beneath the pale sky, pulled my coat closed, and let the silence belong to me again. I had not left broken. I had not left dependent. I had not even left angry. I left with something better than any of that. I left knowing exactly who they were, and making certain they knew I knew.